Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how you doing today? Well, in today's video, I'm going to be addressing something that Trish had sent me, okay? You all know Trish, and you know what she's all about, okay? You know that she is a retired international banker. She is a day trader, okay? And when it comes to financial prepping, it's what she's all about, okay? She wrote this out for me, and she said, your people, your subscribers have asked, so here is the answer, okay? So it starts out like this. Now it's a little long, and I will tell you that, okay? But I read through this, and the information that is here is so important that the first thing that you're going to need is coffee. Okay? So that should give you a little bit of a perspective. So it starts out like this. Did you know that the United States of America actually has a plan in the event that they can no longer service their debt? They do. Adopted it back in the early 2000s. Meet the 6900 protocols. This is how the U.S. Treasury would handle an economic collapse. It's called the 6900 series of protocols. It would start with the Secretary of Treasury declaring a force majeure, preventing the United States of America from servicing its debt. This, of course, would immediately be interpreted by the marketplaces as a de facto repudiation of U.S. debt. They even know precisely what time they would make such a declaration. 11:38 a.m. Eastern U.S. time. That's because by 11:38 a.m. Eastern time, markets in Asia and Europe will be closed, leaving only U.S. markets operating for a few more hours. A few seconds after that, an announcement would be made. All United States markets, both equities, debt, and commodities, i.e. like stocks, bonds, commodities, that have trading limits or permissible daily limits, would all be limited offered with pools. Limited offers means that there are more sellers at the limit, i.e. limit down, than there are buyers. So-called pools would immediately begin to form, probably 1,000 contracts every few minutes. Limited offered with pools, this is trader language, not traitor, trader. Pools to sell 2,000 lots, 3,000 lots. That means the number of sellers over and above the available buyers at the limited offered price. That would begin to build. By 1 o'clock, the news would begin to sink in because it would take a while before panic selling would arise from the public. This news would be released at lunch hour. Most of the American people initially would not even understand the horror of the news. You would see professional selling at first, and as that professional selling intensified over the afternoon, the SEC, the CFTC, NASDAQ, and various market regulatory authorities would begin to institute certain emergency market protocols. This would be the installation of the so-called Declaration of Fast Market Conditions. For instance, the Declaration of No More Stop Orders, the Declaration of Fill at Any Price, etc., in a desperate bid to maintain liquidity. That first day, the Dow Jones Industrial Average and related indices on a percentage basis would lose about 20 to 30% of their value by the close of business that day. The real impact would come overnight when the American people found out what this was all about when it was explained to them. The SEC and various regulatory entities have anticipated the market's decline hour by hour, and they will be closely watching every move down the markets make. It is widely expected that circuit breakers will be triggered within an hour, then triggered again until the market suspends trading for the rest of the day. When Japan's market opens the next day, we will call this day 2. What would happen is almost instant collapse. At 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time, the Tokyo markets would open, and no price would be affixed for probably 3 or 4 hours into the session due to the avalanche of selling. Once prices are established, the government of Japan would close all of its financial markets. Europe would not even open. All European governments would close all capital exchanges. When the U.S. goes down, everything around the world in financial matters goes with us. On the second day, here in the U.S., Army forces would be dropped in via parachute to the cities where the 12 Federal Reserve District banks are located. The reason they would be brought in by parachute is there wouldn't be enough time to do this via driving. Those troops would have to be in place around the 12 Federal Reserve banks to protect the plexiglass pallets of currency in their vault, stacked to the ceiling, and whatever gold is also inside. The origin of these U.S. Treasury protocols comes from the Department of Defense, or DoD. The DoD has contingency plans for a variety of scenarios. And those scenarios would include, obviously, military collapse or World War III and its aftermath. What we're talking about now is the aftermath. How the aftermath of the U.S. being unable to service its debt would be handled. One does not necessarily know how the events would transpire that would cause the collapse, whether it's military collapse or economic collapse. In World War III, it would become obvious when the mushroom clouds started to appear over cities. Economic collapse scenarios were always premised on the basis of a U.S. declaration of force majeure on debt service in a very extensive scenario. The scenarios are all together, i.e. military, economic, political, social, complete destabilization leading to collapse. Then they break down individual scenarios. In the economic collapse scenario, the starting point would be the United States Treasury declaring a force majeure on debt service, which is a de facto repudiation, and that's how it would be interpreted by the world's capital marketplaces. Then the scenario goes on from there. The U.S. Treasury would obviously declare a force majeure after the European markets had closed. In other words, they had gone out for the day, which means 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, our time. They'd wait until the European markets closed and the U.S. markets had been open for a couple of hours. That's when they determine how to begin the process of unwinding or controlling the collapse to the best extent possible. mainly because they know that the greatest hedge pressure would be people seeking to use other markets to hedge their long exposure in the United States, and that the U.S. would be the biggest seller in all of the rest of the world's markets. Therefore, you would want to declare the force majeure when the rest of the world's markets closed to catch them off guard. The declaration of force majeure would be precipitated by the declaration that the United States is no longer able to service its debt. That's pretty simple. So who makes that decision? The Treasury Department. The President does not make that decision. The Secretary of Treasury does. He has that authority. And you might ask, wouldn't he have his arm twisted not to do that? And the answer is that if there isn't any money left to service the debt, it doesn't make any difference what the current regime might want to do. The day of reckoning is now coming. What has happened in the interim from 2001 to present, the dynamic global economic deterioration, the economic deterioration visited upon the United States by rampant deficit spending enacted by Congress, is not a localized event. It is, in fact, global. We have a planet now that is sinking into a sea of red ink. Back around the year 2008, the United States was consuming about 80% of the entire world's savings to finance its debt. At some point after 2008, the U.S. began to need more than the entire world had to lend. Enter the U.S. Federal Reserve, monetizing debt by entering digits into a computer account. Presto. Money created out of thin air to buy treasury bonds. Bringing this problem to a head is the issue of the central banks of Germany, Japan, and Saudi Arabia. They are no longer the powerhouses they used to be. Their reserves have now been substantially depleted. They can therefore no longer hide the fact that they own a certain number, likely in the trillions of dollars, of U.S. Treasury debt that isn't being serviced, because they can't hide it through bookkeeping tricks anymore because their reserves are so depleted. And this is why, not too long ago, someone put an arm on Great Britain and demanded payment in gold bullion. It was all very hush-hush. Very serious amounts of gold, silver, bullion, and cash money was abruptly removed from the United Kingdom on April 13th, 2021, and shipped to Doha, Qatar, without explanation. Authorities in London did a rolling roadblock along the motorway to allow the tremendous shipment of bullion and cash to get through. 3 armored bullion trucks, 4 unmarked police cruisers, 6 marked police cars, and a police helicopter were following in the sky. Someone is putting demands on Western banks because they see the U.S. money is in a gigantic trouble. Someone is saying to the U.S., you've got to start servicing this debt because we and the foreign central banks are in nations, European and Asian, whose reserves are now nearly exhausted. We no longer trust you to pay the debt. We want gold now. Foreign central banks can no longer make it appear that the U.S. debt is being serviced because those foreign central banks' own reserves are so substantially depleted. Therefore, the U.S. and the West in general are being told they must begin to cover this debt. If the U.S. cannot or will not, Then at some point, people in the banking around the world will have to publicly admit, in order to save their own necks, that they were in the end buyers of a lot of stealth debt, a lot of debt that the U.S. Treasury issued illegally and as never serviced. That would then expose the whole cabal. I'm not done. The process of unraveling has already begun because of ever spiraling budget deficits. The U.S., even in its overt policies, is generating a $2 trillion plus deficit per year. There isn't enough money on the entire planet to lend such amounts to the U.S. because foreign central banks, are so depleted from buying other U.S. debt, they can't refinance the stealth debt by issuing more stealth debt anymore. Nor can they bleed money out of the system like they could in the 1980s. There is no mechanism that they can use anymore to hide expansion of debt that they could be used to service said stealth debt. And they are, quite frankly, running out of assets that they could steal from the American people. So the proverbial day of reckoning is coming. Back in 2008, David Walker, a U.S. comptroller general and chief of the GAO, has said that the United States would no longer be able to service its debt beyond 2009. Yet here we are now in 2021. And how could that be, right? Well, as stated earlier, the Federal Reserve is monetizing U.S. debt. The Fed is entering digits into an account on their computer system, then using that account to buy U.S. Treasury notes, money out of thin air. So what does this mean? The key is in what Walker meant when he says the debt can no longer be serviced. It simply meant the United States would no longer be able to pay even the interest on its debts because it needs more than the planet has available to lend them. Therefore, if the planet could no longer generate any more liquidity to lend the United States, one of these three things have to happen. A, there has to be a sudden and dramatic reduction in federal spending. There are only two places that can come from. There would have to be an immediate slashing of defense spending, probably 65 to 75%, or there would have to be an immediate cut in all social programs like welfare, food stamps, Social Security, and the rest, right? Now, B, the other option, 6900B, is a dramatic increase in the rate of federal income taxation from the current nominal rate of 28% to 65 to 85%, which is what the Treasury Department estimated would be required post-2009 to provide the U.S. Treasury with sufficient revenues to continue to service debt. Or C, the third option, 6900C, becomes a declaration of a force majeure on credit service of U.S. Treasury debt by the United States Treasury, which is tantamount to and would be accurately construed as de facto debt repudiation by the United States of America. And when that day comes, in other words, when the U.S. Treasury declares a force majeure on debt, it would not be broadcast on mainstream media. There's no sense because most of the American people don't even understand what it means. The announcement would actually be put on the Federal Reserve wire system, which would, of course, immediately be picked up by all media outlets anyway. And the United States would, in order to accommodate global electronic trading attempt to open the market on the second day, which they would do regardless of price, just to maintain some liquidity. At the end of day 2, the Dow Jones and related indices would have lost 2/3 of their value, and prices would be set accordingly. Now on day 3, the New York Stock Exchange, the SEC, and other related agencies would recommend to the United States Treasury and the Federal Reserve that all markets be closed. That would be on the morning of day 3. At 11 a.m. Eastern Time, the Federal Reserve would then order all domestic banks closed. At 9 p.m. Eastern Time on day 3, the President of the United States would declare a state of martial law. All financial transactions would come to an end. The Treasury would act to formally demonetize the US dollar and declare it worthless. Now, this would be totally unprecedented. In the past, collapses have been temporary and have been brought back up, but what we're talking about now is the end. And these protocols that I'm referring to aren't even all that secret. They were publicly aware, although all through like the Clinton era, okay? These are Treasury protocols that were instituted mostly in the late 70s when the Treasury and Federal Reserve began to feel that it was important to have an emergency collapse protocol in place. What precipitated the timing of this was the inflationary spiral of the mid-late 70s during the Nixon-Ford terms up to that point, right? And the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve were both concerned that inflationary spiral, which was occurring not only domestically but globally, might lead to a global uncontrollable hyperinflation that the Federal Reserve or major central banks could not stop by traditional means, i.e. by raising interest rates, contracting money supply. There was also recognition, of course, that global central reserve bank bullion inventories had been so depleted over the previous 30 years that any reinstitution of a species currency, even on a temporary basis, and even within a regional or individual nation-state basis, was no longer possible. In a military scenario now, like the President of the United States pushing the final red button, the commit button, the Treasury Secretary of the United States has a similar mechanism. It's called the yellow button, the commit button. The Secretary of Defense has the same button. This is what happens. Computer programs start to institute these protocols. Imagine the complexity of trying to manage all of this. I think it's going to happen all simultaneously. There are hundreds of different agencies involved, both domestically and internationally, in order to maintain liquidity for as long as possible. It has to be extremely well coordinated, and there must be existing collapse protocols that can be used. All federal agencies had individual collapse protocols that ultimately got coordinated through the Department of Defense. Obviously, the Department of Defense would be the ultimate coordinator because it would need to have special forces available on a standby basis, ready, that could quickly parachute into the areas all over the country, and to the cities particularly, to secure federal properties and assets. And that's literally how it would begin. By the end of the third day, it would be all over, a state of martial law. We're not talking about war now. This is just economic collapse. There's no military implication here, no political, no social implication, no policy directive. This is just strictly economic collapse. By the end of day 3, effectively, all banks in the world would be shut down. All paper currencies will become valueless. Martial law would be declared. There would be no continuing transactions, at least for a period of time, of commodities. All providers of fuels and foods would be shut down automatically. They would have this planned in extremely great detail, too. For instance, the U.S. Department of Defense Special 117th Assault Unit would parachute into seize control of the cattle yards in Oklahoma City. This is how well it's planned. In other words, economic collapse would automatically involve expansive military action and control. By the end of the 3rd day, when you no longer have a domestic medium of exchange, you have secured food and fuel stocks. You've got to have troops that have secured distribution points where there's food, fuel, stocks, warehouses, tanks, etc. In a military or economic collapse situation, National Guard units would be called in to provide services in order to combat whatever the problem is, right? Federal troops would be used in order to have the specific authority simply to shoot anyone. There are plans for all sorts of scenarios. The economic disaster scenario is the one I always found the most intriguing because it is the one that is the least understood by the American people. Military control would be necessary when lines begin to form at the banks because trying to understand their money, but that wasn't even anticipated as a big problem. Lines would form at the banks, but it was not even envisioned until sometime on day 3 because the American people wouldn't get it. It would be announced that the stock markets are down 2,000, 3,000 points. And since we've always been taught they'll come back, the people would still be buying stocks. You could count on some people remaining in ignorance all the way down because much of the American people have never been taught the truth about Economics 101. The American people would realize the full extent of it until the markets were closed on the 3rd day, or until the time when they went down to cash the check and the bank was closed with soldiers out in front. Then they would go down and see the gas stations are closed. See the local supermarket has been shuttered. There's federal troops in front of it. And they begin to catch on. And remember, it's not just federal troops now. In emergency collapse protocols, even before the declaration of a formal state of emergency or a state of martial law, the local military authorities within a given country or jurisdiction have the ability to essentially militarize anyone. And that is any civilian. This would be more than just deputizing civilians. It's federal. In other words, they would have the ability to militarize or give military authority to a civilian force. This would include not only police and the sheriffs and state police, but all local law enforcement that exists below the state level would be immediately militarized. They wouldn't just take anybody like they did in Iraq. It would be like the military when they call for volunteers, right? In other words, this is how it would unfold over 3 days. But in fact, not enough Americans would know what to do about it or how to take any precautions. They would have a clue because many don't understand enough about economics to know what is happening. On Washington Journal, they were talking about how FEMA has recommended to the Office of Homeland Security to have increased restrictions regarding citizen hoarding of long-term food and fuel supplies. It's pretty sinister too, you know. What they're talking about is the purchase of long-term survival food. And FEMA was talking about some sort of restriction preventing people from accumulating food stores. And the second point was to increase restrictions that already exist, right? And FEMA was recommending even tighter restrictions on citizens building their own private underground storage tanks for the purpose of long-term storage of fuel on their own property. The real intent of this is threefold. One is to restrict citizens' ability to hoard food. Two is to restrict citizens' ability to hoard long-term storage of fuel. And three, the forced identification of citizens to reveal food and fuel stocks they may be hoarding. And that, in my opinion, is the real essence, right? And the government wanted this to kept secret. And having the FEMA supply restrictions angle put into the equation because they knew how people would interpret it. They have tried to use this environmental legislation to restrict people's ability to build fuel storage facilities on their own property to get around what the true intent of that was. In other words, what you don't want is citizens who have the ability to store a lot of food and fuel and to own gold because they would be able to resist state control in the future. So people like us, preppers. The feds need to have every citizen on a rationing card to control the civilian population. You can't have citizens out there hoarding food and fuel because then people can say to the government, I'm not taking that rationing card with my national ID card. I don't have to. You can't control me through food and fuel and this worthless paper currency. That pattern is becoming increasingly clear here, and so is the future. So I'll ask you this question. How much is the paper currency of a bankrupt nation worth? I'll wait. If and when you hear the phrase force majeure, and force majeure is actually French, okay? Force and then majeure is M-A-J-E-U-R-E, okay? When you hear that, you will have only hours to get to the supermarket, buy as much food as you can with whatever cash or credit you have left, and haul your butt home and bug out as fast as you can if you plan to bug out or bug in or whatever the case may be, okay? Now, bear in mind, too, the banks will get word of this before the rest of the people do. They may cut off all credit cards before the public is even told to force majeure. That would mean you could only buy more food with cash. Got enough cash to do that? The only ones that are going down are the ones that are prepared. Picture the Titanic in its last moments, still floating. While the lifeboats were half a mile and all the screaming that they heard, then pick up the oars and begin to row in the opposite direction so the sinking ship didn't suck you under. All right? Now, this is why we prepare, okay? This is why they come after us. This is why preppers are the most hated, because they know they can't take us the fuck down. Stack up to the damn ceiling. Whatever your comfort foods are, like mine, coffee, chocolate, whatever it is, okay? Don't just buy regular food. Buy your comfort food, okay? Buy your HBA or health and beauty aids, okay? But everything, okay? I mean, don't let there be a toilet paper shortage and leave some for others, right on? But I'm telling you, this is coming. I'm going to be doing another video, okay, that Trish asked me to do. Why? Because she's like me, and she's like the rest of you. She's sick and tired of the rich getting richer and the rest of us sitting here going, how am I going to pay my bills? How can I prep when I have to worry about this? How can I prep when I have to worry about that? Well, guess what? She found a solution. She's going to help you. She's helping me. Okay? I love you. I love you. And I'll see you in the next one, okay? Stay safe. Stay positive. Keep prepping. By all means, keep prepping. Prep, 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 prep. Don't stop. Don't stop. I didn't mean to yell, but you know me. I'm Italian. I yell. All right? Fear less, okay? I'll see you in the next one.